I like complexity and contradiction in architecture. I do not like the incoherence or arbitrariness of incompetent architecture, nor the precious intricacies of picturesqueness or expressionism. Instead, I speak of a complex and contradictory architecture based on the richness and ambiguity of modern experience, including that experience which is inherent in art. Architects can no longer afford to be intimidated by the puritanically moral language of orthodox modern architecture. I like elements which are hybrid rather than pure, compromising rather than clean, distorted rather than straightforward, ambiguous rather than articulated, perverse as well as impersonal, boring as well as interesting, conventional rather than designed, accommodating rather than excluding, redundant rather than simple, vestigial as well as innovating, inconsistent and equivocal rather than direct and clear. I am for messy vitality over obvious unity. I include the non sequitur and proclaim the duality. Welcome. You're listening to a podcast about buildings and cities. I'm Luke Jones.
I'm George Kinjal.
And we're talking about complexity and contradiction in architecture, which I think we promised to do about 20 episodes ago, offhand, in one of the episodes on Aldo Rossi.
This is the third person to die before we've got to them.
We have a strange power, which is to identify someone as an interesting subject for analysis, and then to cause their subsequent death.
Yes.
Rem is holding out. Thank
Yeah,
God.
so far so good. But we haven't done the big Rem series yet. There's still time.
Yes, they never get to find out what we thought of them. That's one thing. This is a pretty famous book in architectural history, but I guess we should frame what it is. So Robert Venturi is one of the most famous post-war American architects. Venturi is really seen as the father of postmodernism in architecture. And in this book and the subsequent Learning from Las Vegas, written with his wife and architectural partner, Denise Scott Brown, dethroning modernism and ushering in a new stylistic era in design. I think it's all a little bit more complicated than that. And there are lots of things which people kind of would probably assume are in the book which aren't as well. Or there tends to be a bit of a slippage, I think, between the programme on the one hand of Complexity and Contradiction, released in 1966, I believe, and Learning from Las Vegas, which came out in the early 70s.
But something which is clear is that this is exactly what he was intending to do. It explicitly says at the beginning, I mean, he doesn't write it, he gets Vincent Scully to do it. This is going to be the new, towards a new architecture. It's a completely different paradigm. This is going to be for the late 20th century what that was for the early 20th century. And it's going to redefine architecture. And it's going to be like this from now on.
Yeah, so is he a Yale art historian, Vincent Scully, kind of influential figure in that whole movement? Yes, and he rather hyperbolically in the original introduction said this is going to be the most important book in architecture since Towards the New Architecture. And I think he sort of wasn't wrong in the sense purely of measuring its standing. I think I don't think he is wrong in the narrative of architectural history and theory. It registers about as large. Well, first thing to say is that the book has two parts, a long part and a short part. The long part is a long illustrated essay on the subject of complexity and contradiction with 10 chapters. And the short part is a little documentation of Venturi's own work with his then business partner, John Rauch. And I think it sort of depends how long we take on it. It's possible that the latter of those will get discussed on the bonus. It rather depends how we go. So we'll see. I guess I think that the label of this is modernism and this is postmodernism probably obscures a little bit about what's specific about the project at this point in time, which is in the mid-60s. It's important to remember how early this book is. There's a moment sort of about halfway through where I notice he's talking about Le Corbusier in the present tense because he's still alive at the time when he was writing that particular section.
Although he died when it came out.
Yeah, yes. Well, yes, he has the power as well. So when we think of postmodernism, the postmodern works, actually we tend to be thinking of things which happened in the sort of second half of the 70s, really. There's quite a lot to go until then. And I think it's important to set out maybe just to sketch what is it that's different about Robert Venturi from, on the one hand, a slightly older generation like Louis Kahn, who he worked for, or his vague contemporaries, and fellow iconoclasts, in a sense, people like Alison and Peter Smithson and Aldo van Eyck. What I would say is that all of them, in their way, are interested in history. Venturi differs from Kahn in that he is much less interested in the seeming unity and kind of primal form, which Kahn is trying to investigate, this kind of fundamental condition of architecture as an interrelation of materials, sort of monumental characteristics, light, sun, space, these universals. And on the other hand, also kind of different from members of, people like the Smithsons and Van Eyck, for whom history's role in the new architecture is, in a sense, anthropological. It's kind of, we sort of draw on the lessons of these fundamental archetypes like the street or the hut or whatever, and then transpose those into the program of a modern architecture, which is going to contain the people and their lives in the future. In Venturi, by contrast, history is this series of often quotations, kind of allusions, which are layered and collaged, and whose real role is communicative. Like society, in the way he thinks of it, relates to architecture primarily through communication, or that sort of foregrounded is the real problem. Whereas I think for people working at the same time as him, like in Team 10 or whatever, it's really actually providing like space, program, and the kind of network which sustains the activities of people's social and cultural lives.
At this point, there's a couple of things. The first one, really obviously, is I think essentially all architects are interested in history. You can try as hard as you want to not be interested in history, which would be like Hilberseimer, Hans Meyer, but even they are sort of stuck with it. They're stuck with it because they're so trying to fight against the stream that they're like defined by its absence or defined by an inversion of it. So really it's what it means, because also society is something which hasn't just popped up out of nowhere, and cities haven't either. Well, certainly the cities around here haven't. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I'm not really sure, in Complexity and Contradiction, what history does mean to him. He doesn't explicitly, in his examples, really draw on it at all yet. He will later on in his career. But it seems to me that he isn't explicitly proposing learning from history as more of like going out into the jungle, trying collecting but different shapes of butterflies and saying,
no, it's not like the Italian rationalists, where there's this very clear method, which is a typological one about abstracting things from a historical continuity of some sort and using those can then be deployed as the instruments of architecture.
It feels a bit like he's come over like Marco Polo and he's discovered a new... And at the moment, it seems to be operating at that level where it's specimens in a beautifully stuffed birds of paradise, all there to be examined for the evolution of their beaks. I think it might be worth setting when he was born, where he studied. He was born in 1925. I don't know where. Yeah, so he's born around the time that Towards the New Architecture is coming out.
Yes, because he just died in his 93, right? Yeah, that's right.
Certainly in that period, and would have come of age, I suppose, during the war, which means a rather different thing if you're an American.
Yeah, he studied in Princeton. Yeah, the approach was still like strongly influenced by the Beaux-Arts, essentially, which I think is something that you can read as coming directly from his education and then being explored in a new way in the text. It's very much.
Well, so he would have been studying what in the 40s?
Yeah, late 40s.
So probably still kind of was a Beaux-Arts world for the most part, but very aware of modernism. It probably wasn't strange. The thing is that rather as you discover again and again, rather like with Gothic, the overlap between the Gothic continuation and the Gothic revival, there's a bit of an overlap between the Beaux-Arts and the Beaux-Arts revival, or the sort of postmodern. They almost coincide.
Yeah, lots of people who were raised in it are around for the big revival, or just participate pretty much directly in it. It only needs about 30 years out, which is, or less even.
Well, I mean, in this book, we were talking about last week with the fascist architecture Brasini, who's a full-blown neo-Baroque building in the 40s.
Yeah, and in the 1950s, he was sort of visiting it and thinking it was rather wonderful.
Yeah, there's no... Yeah, that's just an aside, really, a sort of historic... That we think of this this age of the complete dominance of modernism.
Yes. So the book positions itself, as you heard in the introduction, very much against a dogmatic and pure modernism, which to some extent is the straw man of the against which the whole text is kind of tilted. I think it's, that certainly wasn't the architecture of the people that he'd worked for.
It's something that's I found going through this the most difficult to get my head around, because it's something I know the least about, which is I was able to kind of try and frame it in the criticism of the age, but in the contemporary architectural culture of America in the 50s and 60s, I just don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's difficult to understand exactly who he's aiming it at.
Is it the people driving motorways through? Is it the same sort of thing that Jane Jacobs is complaining about? But he seems to love motorways.
No, he's talking about buildings.
Yeah.
He's talking about architectural form. In one of the things which he says in a later preface is that he wishes he'd called it complexity and contradiction in architectural form, presumably to distinguish it from the later work, such as Learning from Las Vegas, which is much more concretely about architectural symbolism in his terms. But yeah, that's the ground of the dispute, is form. It's architectural form. I don't think it's the program of modernist urbanism, although cities do figure a little bit around the edges. It's interesting. So Venturi died, like a couple of months ago?
Yeah.
And it was interesting, reading, lots and lots of people were sort of writing about what he meant to them and this kind of thing. And I was interested, as someone who candidly is not really a fan of the work, to try to understand what it was that they were getting from him. I think that you might divide it into a few different things. One, I think, is that and referring specifically to this book, actually, one of the things people get from it is that it's written in this very kind of clear, approachable language, which really makes it quite different from all sorts of other works of architectural history and theory. It's extremely easy to read. It's lavishly illustrated. I think that it occasionally hides a certain evasiveness or tendentiousness behind this reasonableness of affect. So I think that what complexity and contradiction mean seems completely undefined, and that seems to be very, very, rather egregiously so throughout most of the text. It just shifts all over the place. We'll get into that.
You say it's clear. The level of the sentence is very clear. It's quite limpid. He's pretty straightforward. In a way, it's similar to I've forgotten what they're called. They're like the American opposite of the Smithsons.
Oh, the Eames.
The Eames. It's a bit like the sort of propaganda language of the Eames, which is very self-consciously open, clear, not populist in a political way, but trying to communicate very openly. But then at the level of the chapter, it's kind of meandering and doesn't really... The arguments don't pile up on each other to make a solid construction. It's a lovely walk through the garden path, looking at the flowers. So
I think another thing which I detected people were getting out of him was in this in this I like quotation, this list of things which he doesn't like, there appears to be an attack on orthodoxy in general, and a kind of openness to like a more diverse range of practices and approaches. And reading some people, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think for some people this program has sort of tended to be transposed to mean something more kind of contemporary than it obviously did in 1966, which I think is fine. I think that that's totally reasonable to draw on whatever resources you want to and to deploy them in the way that you want. I don't think it's particularly... I think that to call for like, compromising rather than clean, ambiguous rather than articulated, Venturi has a very clear idea of what he means by that, and it would actually exclude an awful lot of things, as we'll see once we get into the text. But I think if you find that kind of polemic, I don't know, has some sort of promise for you.
I prefer virtue to vice.
Virtue to vice. No, that's not what he's saying, though.
No, I know.
Yeah.
It does seem a little bit... Anyway, that's
messy vitality. I mean...
Another thing is that I think this exists towards the end, or right at the end, of the great era of doctrinaire manifesto throwing up, which is the sort of mid-20th century, right? From the period between Towards a New Architecture and this, there's people putting out manifestos all the time. Yeah. Like all of those Italians, or people with proposal for how Europe is going to be rebuilt, or what different sort of, or Team 10, or we're going to... And we've had so many attempts at creating a rational system, and this is saying, actually, the system should be the anti-system, and then the sort of idea of writing manifestos disintegrates.
An architecture of complexity and contradiction has a special obligation towards the whole. Its truth must be in its totality, or its implications of totality. It must embody the difficult unity of inclusion, rather than the easy unity of exclusion. More is not less. Well, I think that that's definitely something which you could get behind, but we're going to see what it means specifically in the terms in which Venturi wants to define it. Okay, well, should we go into the...
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you've actually had about 30% of the first chapter there. The first one's very short.
It's called Non-Straightforward Architecture, A Gentle Manifesto. It's interesting that there are two exclusions, and people tend to kind of dwell on one rather than the other, don't they? The exclusion of this slight sort of straw man, like pure, exclusive modernism, which allows none of the messy vitality of real life, is one. But the other one, which he doesn't like, is expressionism.
Yeah, the picturesque.
Yeah, which is an interesting one. I mean, we kind of get into what that means in the second chapter, in this famous... do you think there's more stuff to say about the first one, or can we talk about
I think we can go on.
The second one. The second one lays this out in more detail: simplification or picturesqueness. He makes this famous condemnation of Michelucci's Church of the Autostrada, which he talks about. Did we read this quote in the last episode?
I think we certainly alluded to it if we didn't read it. Well, but before then, there's another example before then, which is against simplification. I think it's worth sort of mentioning both of them quickly. So the chapter is called Complexity and Contradiction versus Simplification or the Picturesque. So it's, the two things versus one or the other. His example of simplification is this house by Johnson. Well, two houses, one of which is a glass box, which you can imagine. One of those ones where you can't quite imagine where the toilet is, except it's in the only sort of solid bit of the building. And the other one is a glass box on top of a stone house, a stone oblong house, and it's called the Wiley House, in which the sort of living quarters are on the ground, and the glass box at the top is the reception room, living room. And he's complaining that this is rather boring, unexciting, because it's just this obvious representation of separation. The first one doesn't really work because it's all glass. It's the inappropriate application of what he calls pavilion architecture. And the second one is inappropriate because it is just a statement of sort of theory or dictum. But they're both actually quite cool.
I tend to agree with him that the Wiley House doesn't look that good. But
I don't know. I quite like it. But you wouldn't do lots of them. But you wouldn't try to do lots of them either.
Also, the measure of whether it works or not is really not how it looks from the outside. I mean, the purpose of putting a glass box in a landscape is very rarely to... Or the fulfillment of a glass box in a landscape is not to look from the outside at the glass box, is it? That's not what they're for. It's the other way around. Yeah, well, we'll see more of that. Then against picturesqueness, he has this famous comparison between Alvar Aalto's church in Imatra and Giovanni Michelucci's church of the Autostrada near Florence, which we discussed on the last but one episode. I mean, the first thing to say is that he later deprecates the comparison completely and thinks that they're both good. Yeah. He has the good grace to put in a little footnote saying, "I'm sorry."
I mean, it's a comparison that from pictures you could make either way, I think. But it's essentially saying that the Alto church, where it is asymmetric and divided and complex, it's doing that with sort of reason.
Yes, it has some allusions to the traditional nave and two aisles plan, in the sense that within the expressionist kind of interior, there's a narrow bit on the left and a sort of narrow bit on the right, which are vaguely indicated in the different ways in which the wall behind the altar bends up and becomes a ceiling. They're sort of these different ribbons which are slightly offset. And for him, it's very important that gestures back towards history at the same time as being very much its own thing. And I think that he seems to have a big problem with the fact that the Autostrada has no obvious or legible reproduction of a historical image.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's quite true, because there are two aisles of columns, which screams church, but it's very... He's bashed it. Michelucci bashed it apart a lot.
I would say. I mean, and I think that this, for one thing, tells you about Venturi's particular focus, because I think that the Church of the Autostrada has a very, very clear connection to the church as a type, which is not formal but phenomenal. It's at the level of sense, and it's at that you go into it, you have this sense of this vast space above you, which goes up into this imponderable blackness. You have the monumental character of the supports. You have the monolithic materiality, in this case concrete, and then there is some stone and stuff down at the bottom. So at the level of material, and at the way that, and then there's the way the light comes in, in these little points, which are, or these sort of hidden far off bits really far up, which allow the glow to kind of trickle in. All of those things communicate absolutely at the level of sense and at the level of material and these sorts of things, that you're in a church is very, very recognisably a church.
Oh, I felt that very strongly but both times I was there, particularly the first time. But it does have some very strong inversions of the church site, making the it turns it around 90 degrees, and in fact it rotates the axis of the church 90 degrees from the original plan, which does disrupt it a lot. I think what Venturi is picking up on, and what he particularly doesn't like, is that it is willfully that he accuses the design of these asymmetrical, uneven columns of being willfully picturesque, so that they could be like this or any other way. All the columns are different. I mean, actually, it's in a way because they're making a landscape, and then each column is responding to the landscape. It's not different columns in the same place. It's different columns in different places. But I think he's picking up on that, and I think in a way that's a criticism that you can certainly make on paper.
It's something which is important because it brings into focus what for him counts as the elements of a complex and contradictory architecture, and what things don't count. And it's very important that the things which count have to be legible in a very particular way. They have to be legible, identifiable, references which ideally are at some level a quotation. Yeah? And the Church of the Autostrada is extremely complex and contradictory as an experience, but everything has been very abstracted from the original historical reference, and what it draws on is, like the sensory.
I don't think he's that clear about it.
I don't think he's not being clear about it.
He's not being clear about it.
This is the thing which I think is really important, is that the book is very elusive. It's behind its reasonableness. It's extremely elusive. And I think one of the struggles that we have to go through, or should, is to try to nail down the implicit rules, which he will not, refuses to declare, but which nevertheless are clear from the judgments about what's good and what's bad. And I think that that's totally possible to do, but we have to infer them. They're not said explicitly, because to do so would force him to contemplate that they are a bit off in a lot of ways.
I know we're lingering a long time on this example, but it's quite I also wanted to challenge his notion of being willfully picturesque. In architecture, of the sort in the age of the architect, rather than Ruskin's Gothic, architects design everything. It's only there. It's either willful or it's unintentional. There's nothing really in between. You can make criticisms of, I haven't been to this Alto building, but I've been to other Alto buildings. I think they're very good. But you can easily make a criticism that he is sort of willfully, all these just off 90-degree angles, all of this just accommodating the human form, so cosy, so scanty design.
I know. It's sickening, isn't it?
So sort of, it's so willfully, cutifying it's willfully and picturesquely cutifying the conventions of modernism, which I think is what made it so incredibly popular in the post-war period in this country and abroad. I mean, Alto had a real time in the sun when he was a real megastar. Actually, I don't think that's really a particularly valid criticism of him. But it's the same sort of criticism of calling the Autostrada Church willfully picturesque. I mean, it's very obvious that he has made a lot of effort to make things irregular and so that people enjoy that, rather as Alto has made them irregular and soft so that people enjoy it in a different way. To accuse an architect of being willful is almost to accuse him of being legible. And while it's quite fun to have some stuff where you can't read what they're trying to do or you have to unpick it, architecture that you have to really carefully scrutinise and unpick doesn't really seem to be what Venturi does. He's more into the obvious, slap-in-your-face message.
Oh, well, I mean, we'll get onto that when we get onto the buildings, I guess.
But certainly, I think you could kind of invert the images and sort of change a few words and make the criticism run both ways.
You could, which is why I say that the comparison that is not really what's at issue at all. That actually what's revealed is much more subtextual, or it's, as he says, it's about the legibility of the tripartite plan in the Alto Church. So what's valued is the fact that there is something which you can say, here's this historical reference, which we could almost separate out as a little diagram, and that's a component of it. The fact that is the thing which is valued and which distinguishes good expressionism in architecture from bad expressionism in architecture, I think is the really significant thing.
Yeah. Anyway, good. I've registered. I always think the criticism that architects are being willfully something is... That's not a criticism on its own. You have to say something else.
Willfully.
That...
willfully, yes.
Yes, that architect did intend that. That was on purpose, is more or less what it seems to be saying. Just to clarify, people criticising things for being willful, which, as far as I'm concerned, means on purpose, which isn't a criticism. Obviously, when you design buildings, when buildings are designed, you will, after they are made, discover all sorts of exciting things about them, potentially, or you might not. But usually you discover them because of something you've done on purpose. You've left capacity. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't be trying to, leave space for new discoveries and things. That will always happen. But you have to be accusing someone of committing a sin on purpose. of doing something wrong on purpose. Just accusing them of doing it on purpose is not a criticism.
Yeah, the willfulness is something which you might have done through negligence, but in fact you've done on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he obviously hasn't done it through... no one designs that church by accident.
Yeah. No, I don't think they do. Should we do the next chapter?
On to ambiguity.
Ambiguity, yeah. So it's worth pointing out that there's a famous connection, he famously talks about the work of William Empson, who is a literary critic.
We had this book in the toilet bookshelf at home when I was a child.
What's the word? Literary critic, literary theorist. What do you call? What's the word for
literary criticism?
Yeah,
he's a critic.
Yeah,
he sort of starts new criticism. The book is 7 Kinds of Ambiguity or something. I never read it except little bits of it in the loo. My dad said, well, that's sort of what he says. There are 7 different kinds of criticism. Really, it's an analysis of poetry, and it's an analysis which centres on, as far as I understand it from the little bits that I've read, centres on looking at, for example, metaphoric ambiguity, contrasting things that are alike and unalike, or so he's searching in ambiguity for double meaning or for contradictory meaning, and it also is technically interesting because he's a real close reader. He goes through, he examines things at the structure of a sentence and a sentence in its context because he's looking for ambiguity in the language. So it's that close detail. And I think, and actually when I saw it, I know a lot less about the history of this book in its context. I haven't looked that up at all. It's not part of my culture, my cultural background, really.
Or Empson or Venturi.
Venturi, Empson is.
Yeah.
Probably, although not enormously. But it did strike me that the approach of... it does feel like a sort of new critical, in search of double meanings at the close reading level.
Can I read this paragraph? Because I think it's we should say this got some very nice little pictures, some good projects.
This book, by the way, has got loads, in case we haven't said it, it's worth picking up because it's got loads of lovely black and white pictures of buildings, certainly the European ones, which I'm familiar with, and a sort of, well, we've talked about loads of buildings in this book. Yeah. He's got loads of great examples. He is very erudite, excellent knowledge of, he's been to loads of cool places. I mean, it's not universal in Europe, but it's very broad, and the images are very attractive and very abundant. But it would be nice at some point to compare them to the buildings, I think, in the architecture of the city, which they are different to.
Yeah, it is interesting. He definitely has his favourites, who I think will reappear, and maybe we can spot those as we go along.
Yeah, some of which are definitely on the Megamix, and some of which are kind of slightly
deep cuts.
Yeah.
Okay, let me read this. Ambiguity and tension are everywhere in an architecture of complexity and contradiction. Architecture is form and substance, abstract and concrete, and its meaning derives from its interior characteristics and its particular context. An architectural element is perceived as form and structure, texture and material. These oscillating relationships, complex and contradictory, are the source of the ambiguity and tension characteristic to the meaning of architecture. The conjunction or, with a question mark, can usually describe ambiguous relationships. The Villa Savoie. Is it a square plan or not? The size of Vanbragh's 4 pavilions at Grimsthorpe, in relation to the back pavilions, is ambiguous from a distance. Are they near or far, big or small? Bernini's pilasters on the Palazzo di Propaganda Fide, are they positive pilasters or negative panel divisions? The ornamental cove in the Casino di Pio IV in the Vatican is perverse. Is it more wall or more vault? The central dip in Lutyens' facade at Nashdom facilitates skylighting. Is the resultant duality resolved or not? Luigi Moretti's apartments on the Via Parioli in Rome, are they one building with a split or 2 buildings joined? So each of those those are basically all the pictures in the chapter. We've gone through them. And this is very characteristic that he will often talk for a bit and then suddenly go into the slideshow and do like bang, 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 go through 8 of them quite fast. I mean, are these... I think that there's some... that if we were going to do a bit of close reading, there are a couple of things that I would pick out, and I'm sorry to labour away at this. When he describes what architecture is, the word space is strikingly absent. Really, what he's talking about is he mentions form, he mentions substance, he mentions it's abstract, that is, it's like essentialized or type reading, and he mentions elements, and elements are really what he's the relationship of like.
Well, he's doing a bit of a Ruskin, isn't he? In that he's wanting to win the battle before he's even started by redefining the grounds. You know, this is in I'm not gonna accept even your premises in modernism. I'm not going to accept the premise of discussing architecture critically through space, through the discussion of space. There's a long history of like that, the use of that term. I'm gonna talk about it in these terms, and if you want to talk to me, you can talk to me like that.
So what we've got are 4 views of buildings from the front: 1 a drawing, 3 photos, 1 plan, and 1 picture of an interior, which I think is the ratio that we're going to find pretty consistently throughout. That is almost all either pictures or elevations.
And it's a picture of an interior elevation, really.
Yeah, sort of going up onto a ceiling, I think.
Yeah, that's it. And the pictures, by the way, are often in kind of elevational. There are some which are like 3/4 views, but there are a lot of them are 1-point perspective, which is probably the right way to photograph a Vanbrugh building. They're more dynamic than the previous generation. Vanbrugh is a
English Baroque,
so it's turn of the 18th century, beginning of the 18th century.
It's a good one, isn't it?
Vanbragh's very interesting. He's really irritating because he's one of these people who's a complete dilettante architect. He was a soldier, courtier, poet, flounced around, and then tried his hand at being an architect for a bit, and was very good at it. And is a sort of, I've been thinking about him recently. Is he leading into the neoclassical? But we can
yeah.
But it's certainly a tasteful Beaux-Arty reference.
I think on display here is one of the things which I think Venturi is really good at, which is reading facades. So his description of the Bernini facade, I think, absolutely isolates what's interesting and kind of ambiguous about it. The elements are abstracted to a point where their reading is still legible, but they slightly hover on the threshold of undecidability.
More so, in fact, in the elevation than, if I remember, in the drawing than in the reality.
I'm less convinced by his readings of Lutyens and Moretti, which seem a little bit tendentious, really.
No, the Lutyens one I don't get at all. The Moretti, well, I mean, that's kind of obvious. Yeah, there's 2 masses divided. I mean, I don't really see how that's... It's not very ambiguous.
No, it's definitely a split. This might be one of these blue dress, yellow dress things, but it's definitely a building split in 2. That's how you're meant to read it, isn't it?
It's meant to be a building divided in 2.
Yeah. I have a question, which is, what's the difference between complexity and contradiction as a way of reading a building, which I think is one activity, or as an intended mode of reception for the building, and as opposed to as something to have in your mind when you're designing one? They seem a bit different. How is the designer meant to think about complexity and contradiction? How is that meant to figure?
Well, I think we'll get on to more of that at the end with his works. I think he, in the work section at the end, goes into what he thinks. Although it's all implicit, he never really is an anti-manifesto. He's not willing to be nailed down.
There's an important distinction that he's making here between form and substance as well, which I think is probably worth trying to work out. That form, I think he means the volume of something as it's read,
As it's read sort of pictorially,
Yeah.
rather than you still read a building when you're walking through it and you're experiencing.
Yeah.
But it's
But the substance is literally kind of immanent material.
yeah. It's more like how you. It doesn't include how you feel.
Yeah. I think there's another level on top of it, which is the symbolic or the kind of significatory, which is what is this? What does this element mean? You know, if you put a Corinthian column on the facade, what does that actually express? Which is something which is sort of neither.
Well, I was expecting a lot more of that because this is Venturi and that's up his street, but he doesn't actually do very much of that in this book.
Yeah, we don't get very much of the symbolic. I guess because maybe he's still a little bit within modernism, or maybe he's being restrained.
Yeah, this book feels squarely modernist, actually. He doesn't make it's not an anti-modernist. I don't think this is at all an anti-modernist text.
No, and he always disowned postmodernism as a label,
like every single postmodernist. I've only found one minor. Well, I mean, he wouldn't regard himself as, but I've only found one fairly minor architect who's willing to call himself a postmodernist. I'm sure there are others.
We've got then a couple of chapters on contradictory levels, which is a way to, I think, try to get deeper into the nature of these ambiguous relationships between parts.
So what do you think he means by it?
By what?
Contradictory levels.
Contradictory levels. So what's this one? The
This is
phenomenon of both and. I think that this is where the kind of disingenuousness of what's being said starts to come out. He wants to pathologize modern architecture as either or. It's either or, and he's interested in architecture which is both and. But it's never totally clear what is being excluded from this either or architecture.
Yeah, I mean, so like an example of either or is a church which is a plan which is two intersecting circles. And it's either one or the other. Or it's either round or linear.
No. That's a both and.
Yeah, it's a both and. But everything's. I mean, modernism's like once you strip things back to their basics, you can only play an ambiguity because you haven't gone left to. But I think you get both hands in everything.
So he has the example here. So the tradition either or has characterized orthodox modern architecture. A sunscreen is probably nothing else. A support is seldom an enclosure. A wall is not violated by window penetrations, but is totally interrupted by glass. Program functions are exaggeratedly articulated into wings or segregated separate pavilions. Even flowing space has implied being outside when inside and inside when outside, rather than both at the same time. Such manifestations of articulation and clarity are foreign to an architecture of complexity and contradiction, which tends to include both and, rather than exclude either or.
I can see what he's saying, which is that each of those things in modernist architecture, there is an example of that, where someone has intentionally or willfully. So later on, he talks about Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax building, which has got like where there's not much in the way of kind of what you'd call classically windows. It's like walls of glass, and it's like it was built in a not very salubrious suburb, so he made it into a massive compound by building a unpenetrated, as he would say, wall around it. But then all of the rest of modern architecture doesn't do that. I mean, there are a few exceptions, and you could say there are some modernist things where they've separated the functions into pavilions. Wright does that occasionally again. I think Mies does it sometimes. But you can't go, all of modern architecture is like this because one person does it sometimes. Or two people. It's not. Korb doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in fact, the first two examples are by Le Corbusier, and they're quoted approvingly as examples of both and. So there's the Jourdan house in Ahmedabad, which is this late, rather amazing house, which is presents as a big square, but with lots of cutouts and these recessed voids in it. It looks like a chest of drawers.
I mean, it's a really cool one. It's a more elaborate version, but it's a game he was playing right from the purest villas, as we were discussing whether you have a series of pavilions or whether you have a box, and a box of positive and negative space that's defined by its frame. And it's not as if Corb is unusual in that. Really, ambiguity is crucial to composition, which is why the book on how to critically read poetry is called 7 Kinds of Ambiguity, because so much of that's like, is it dissonant or is it harmonizing? Yeah. That's composition in all art. It's got a lot of that. I mean, he's not willing to be nailed down. He'll give lots of examples of nice things, but he doesn't actually, because he doesn't put in any negative examples.
It's impossible to know what is he thinking of. Maybe we'll get some towards the end. I think there are 1 or 2.
Yeah, there's very, very few negative examples. He has people he doesn't like, critics he doesn't like. He doesn't like this book, God's Own Junkyard, which I haven't read, but I remember the front cover of it. It was a Triangle Bookshop. It's got a black and white cover, which is sort of a collage mess.
Yeah, he has this reading of Hawksmoor's St. George in the East, and of a particular window. You got that in front of you? Yeah. Which I think is
building very well. You used to live rather near it.
It's a nice, which is this. It's the sort of big recessed opening, and then within it there's a tiny little window, and with a little windowsill. So there's like a huge opening and then a tiny window on the back of it, but the keystone is massively overscaled. I think
the tiny window.
It sits on top of the tiny window, like poking down above the top of the recess, but it's scaled to be quite large even for the massive recess, and is completely enormous for the tiny window. So it's got this rather amazing.
Yeah, and you can't as is common, whether it's part of the wall, a keystone of the big aperture, or a keystone of the window. I mean, it's more like the keystone of the window, but it's very strange, and it's doing his typical sort of mannerist neoclassical.
Yeah. And this is so here's to put my cards on the table. I think that this is what Venturi is good at, is that he's good at reading and analysing in this quasi-literary way facades. And really the book is primarily focused on facades. He will often say that he's going to talk about something else, but actually we'll come back to the facade. It's really the focus of interest for him. And he has these quite short, but I think very astute observations about the way that they work and the way that they create particular effects through the manipulation of elements.
And in his defence slightly, facades or the elevational level is how you see buildings. Mm. It may not be completely how you experience them.
Yeah, no, they're very important.
And I think actually he's not so good. He doesn't talk a lot. It's quite rare to talk a lot about the movement through. But the movement through actually is a really crucial level of appreciation. He's not so interested in that. But he's very good on, what the rectangle arranging. Mm-hmm. Which is so funny that he doesn't really do any of it in his.
Yeah, I know. That's one of the real contradictions in the project as a whole.
He's not a North London rectangle arranger. He's not a sort of about creating this beautiful, perfect, harmonious, dissonant facade, is it?
No. So he says, I think that there are also, his analysis of the Laurentian library stair is just wishful thinking, though. He talks about it as being. He says that the stair is overscaled for the room that it's in, but is appropriately scaled for the size of the library overall. But I just think that that's not true. I think that the stairs are deliberately overscaled for the room that they're in, and it's all about the impression that they create in the room that they're in. I don't think that there's any kind of balance or harmony which is being created there.
We discussed this staircase at length, and I've thought about it more subsequently, that whole room, and there's 2 things that are going on. Well, there's 3 things. One is, the room is masterful. It's an absolutely brilliant piece of architecture, and its brilliance is in subversion and things. The second one is it's meant to be too big, and the third one is it's not really finished, the design, and so some of the awkward gawkiness comes from the fact that he never sorted it out and wasn't there to finish it, which is, I think it's a mixture of brilliance, intentional unbalancedness, and unintentional not finishedness. That's what it's like. It's an enigma, which is why lots of people are drawn to that stair, because it's so weird.
Yeah. We get a bit later on in the chapter, we get a bit of reading of plans, which he particularly wants to read as plans as the combination of multiple geometric figures or different types. So he talks about the way in which Borromini's San Carlino plan synthesizes a Greek cross and some other, various other things all together and produces. It is on page 27. But I think the design of that building is very fascinating.
Oh, it's this one.
Yeah, it's the tiny little amazing church in Rome. There's a very long and quite wild book by Paolo Portoghese, which is all about trying to reconstruct the exact way in which it's all been designed and everything has been put together, which is
it's super good, this building, right?
Yeah, it's an incredibly intricate piece of design, quite extraordinary,
and it's lovely. It's got lots of things where it's got one of those things he doesn't talk about, which is that it's got the same language at different levels of sort of complexity and intensity as you move between the crypt, the exterior, the main body, and the weird little bit round the. It's got that
tiny courtyard
that
thing,
funny corridor and courtyard.
Yeah, he's right that it's a profoundly ambiguous space, but it often is at the level of the element. There are things which, appear to be an element applied to the wall, but which then dissolve or unroll further down in some way, which is unsettling. And I think it is open to that kind of analysis, but really its effect is spatial, isn't it? It's the way in which it sort of seems to lean in and recede, and the placement of the columns and everything else are all calculated to enhance this real.
It's not an exciting ambiguity between. The idea that you're going to be ambiguous between between a church in the round and a lineage and an oval church.
Isn't
an exciting ambiguity.
It's not what's moving you in there.
The ambiguity about weight and form is the exciting one.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of moving in and out constantly, and things on the wall are sort of coming in and going away from you. And it's one of the great treasures of world architecture, really, this church. It's quite extraordinary. But it's not the way that Venturi seeks to understand or to talk about its ambiguity is not meaningful.
No, he doesn't. He's not one to talk too much about movement. He's quite static. He's quite like how Palladio is quite static sometimes. A succession of one-point perspectives and elevations. Like at his best, Palladio can kind of subvert that. But it feels like that sort of reading where it is a reading of fixed frames. And the Borromini Church kind of subverts that because it's got this great, amazing facade which is only viewed right close up. And can't be appreciated. You appreciate it by craning your neck up.
Yeah, you can't see it anywhere.
Well, you kind of can. I think you get the best of it. I don't think it would benefit from being seen a long way away. I think a lot of that energy is to do with making it forceful up close. Because if you were at a distance, all of that moving in and out in the facade would be flattened.
My memory is you're constantly just drifting off into reverie and then very nearly being run over by a car because they got these tiny little pavements and there are people absolutely bombing by.
Yeah, when the last time I was there, it was all scaffolding as well on the other building on the other side. Yeah, so you were sort of
a nightmare.
But I think it's on a corner. It's intentional a bit. Not that he preferred to have it in a tight space, but that its facade is designed to be viewed in a tight space to make the best of a difficult situation.
Yeah, and then he has a nice bit. There's a bit which I think is interesting because it's more convincingly about the urban scale, where he talks about how the experience of Christchurch Spitalfields, another Hawksmoor building, transforms as you get closer to it, and that what from far away is this very enormous, completely overscaled, vast spire disappears behind this also very large portico as you get close to it, which I think is...
It's kind of true. It's less true now. They're nice. It's not just ambiguity that's going on, though, is it?
Yeah.
With these buildings, it's not ambiguity. What do Borromini and Hawksmoor have in common in their churches? And Michelangelo. They all are working within a language of classical architecture, but they are all deeply subversive of it. and they're all subversive of it with really strong muscular movements in shape. Hawksmoor with his very deep facades, his very deep muscular, and the same with Michelangelo. His stuff is big, oversized, tough, deep. The movements are big, and that's it's more about, they're more forceful than ambiguous. Sure, things are going in and things are coming out.
Yeah. I think that there is real ambiguity in Hawksmoor in the sense that the readings of particular elements are deliberately between several different readings, or the scalar relationships are often played with to create a slight kind of vertigo between them.
And actually, that's true in all of them. They both play with scale. Borromini plays with scale the least. He plays more with what's solid, what's a solid form.
Yeah, what's solid, what's melting away. So should we do the other half of contradictory levels is this thing that he calls the double functioning element. I found this a bit hard to get a handle on. It has a long bit at the beginning where he sort of is talking really about programming of buildings. So what the function of buildings is and how it accommodates complex different functions. And in essence, he's making, I think, a perfectly valid case in favour of more generic or looser fitting buildings and against this kind of machine age, very tightly fitting built-in furniture sort of approach.
It's difficult to understand what he means by the double function. So the three examples are the Rauschenberg painting, which is a sort of abstract expressionist painting, which also, as part of the artwork, has a chair, like a wooden chair, which has got different sorts of, feels like it's made of several chairs chopped up and stuck back together in the same way.
And the colour continues from the painting onto the chair.
Yeah. The next one is from one of the tea houses of the Katsura Villa. It's a very famous one where it's all this, there's a little bit of raised floor, and there's, in this very square pavilion, there's one thin tree trunk coming down making a column, which has a shelf, which is very light, and the shelf is supported on the other corner by a bamboo rod, which is like a tension cable. So you can imagine you've got this thick stick and this thin stick, and this, when the thick stick is uneven and the thin stick is even. And you've got contradictions there, which are very nice. These different things, very tasteful, a bit too tasteful. It's camp.
They're exquisite, yes.
It's like Alto. It's so beautiful, exquisite, you want to punch it.
Yeah.
Mess up its silly little face. But it's very beautiful and very glad it's there. And his third example is, in fact, the basilica that's photoshopped so much in towards new architecture.
Yeah, Santa Maria Cosmedine in Rome, which
Yeah.
I think is a 9th century basilica.
It's very nice. They don't let you take photographs quite militantly in there for some reason.
Because of Le Corbusier.
Because everyone's treating that. It wasn't full of Corb fans when I was there. I didn't realise it was the Corbusier one. It's like, oh, it's that. And what's going on there is that you've got stone columns and piers. So it's like pier, there's a big fat bit of wall that continues down, and then there's a break in that wall which is supported with columns and arches, and then there's another pier, and there's a sort of, and that's how the middle bit of the church is made from the two aisles.
So what he literally says is, in Santa Maria in Cosmedine's nave, the column form results from its dominant precise function as a point support. It can direct space only incidentally in relation to other columns or elements. But the alternating piers in the same nave are intrinsically double functioning. They enclose and direct space as much as they support structure. What does that mean?
Which is strange, because
that means that it's like a wall.
But he says a column can only have that function in relation to another column. But they are in relation to other columns. They're rows of columns. That's how, like, if you go into a church, there's rows of columns on both sides, and they define the middle space. And he says those columns don't double function because they only define space when there's several of them. But in this circumstance, there's always several of them, so they are double. And also, the double function of supporting and defining space, that's a wall. Like, walls The outside wall of this house holds up the building.
But it
And
also keeps out people.
And it defines what's inside and what's outside. And as such, it is a double functioning element.
Yeah.
He can't quite mean that. He must mean something...
No, I think that this bit is really...
He must mean something more sophisticated than that.
He's
That seems
stretching.
so stupid.
Yeah, the cats are a villa. The fact that there's like the bamboo in tension and the wood post in compression. And he says that...
Those are single functions.
To the modern architect, I think... he says like modern architects would find this unsettling,
which is the opposite, because modern architects use that's like absolutely classic modern, like having things hung on cables. That's like how modernists do staircases.
At this point I was like, really, what if I were to tell you, Bob, that all beams are in tension and compression at the same time? You know, like that's talk about double functioning.
What they have in common is that you're getting a view of multiple things working together, like different ways of working. What's really nice about the Katsura thing is that you've got this post, and you've got like all these different material qualities working together in one space, one of each. I've got one board, one post, one plaster wall, one tension stick, one thing together, and they all make a thing. The Rauschenberg painting is like, it's a painting which has got some sort of affordances. It's got a chair which has got a radically different set of how you interact with it. It feels like you should sit the other way around and not look at the painting. That's interesting. The basilica, it's really cool. It's got both piers and columns. That's cool. But it's not double functioning. It's that you're being able to see... It's not that the pier is super interesting, it's that you can see both piers and walls, and so you get this range of effects that your brain can process. But it's not because they're in some way double, it's because there's two things there. In a way, it's like, what you should say is half-functioning elements. Because in order to make these effects, you need multiple elements to do one thing.
Yeah, assemblages of elements.
Yeah. Things that only work if you've got several of them together in a composition. Or perhaps what you could say is compositions with lots of different types of elements can be more exciting if those elements are all used interestingly. And that kind of is what he sort of continues to go on about, really.
I mean, a minute later, he actually is saying that when he talks about Palladio, he's like, well, essentially he's saying that the wall is both a frame and a wall because it's masonry, but it has pilasters on it. Which is, yes, indeed it is.
What a radical idea in architecture. The attached column. It's like this lovely walk, because you've got all of these great... We're attacking it more than in a way it should be attacked, because it's got all these lovely examples. But the stuff that he's saying about them... It's not that it's wrong. I mean, some of it is a bit wrong.
Some of it's wrong, yeah.
Some of it's completely wrong, but mostly it's just... inane.
It's insubstantial, yeah.
It's just astonishingly nothing. I mean, like, if you're going to say that a pier is good because it's like a wall which separates things and holds stuff up.
I mean, it honestly does say that. Have a look if you've got the book. Have a look at the reference to Palladio in chapter 5. Okay, so there's a really great reference on page 40, which is this Ledoux project for a gateway.
Yeah, that one's one that could be in.
I mean, that is a hell of a thing, isn't it?
That's one that could be in. Rossi would put that in as well. That's.
So it's got these two sort of columns standing on their own, and then slightly out of shot, there's this very low wall, and then there's a bridge which kind of bridges across from wall to wall. I think the whole wall is meant to read as a plinth, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so you just have a column on either side standing on its own, but between the two of them, you read almost a missing pediment or something, don't you?
And this wasn't built, I don't think.
No, sadly not. He makes two coinages here, which are the vestigial and the rhetorical element.
Yeah, so he's been talking about vestigial elements before.
I mean, in a sense, the vestigial element seems to be an awful lot of what he's been picking up on as something that he likes, which are like type references almost, especially in plan. The rhetorical element, he's referring to these...
I mean, or just the idea that you have a false niche. Seems to be one. Like a blind window. seems to be a vestigial element. He's not quite willing to say that, but it seems to be what he means. The rhetorical, yes, the double functioning element, the rhetorical element, is an element with no function but communication.
Yeah.
So it's a column that doesn't, a freestanding column.
Like in this great Ledoux reference, the two columns rhetorically kind of create a facade between them, although in fact there's nothing but air.
Or they demark an edge.
Oh, it's good. It's a really good one.
It's a good picture, yeah. But I don't think that the idea of a rhetorical element isn't that. So would he say that they don't exist, rhetorical elements in They certainly, Corbusier has lots of rhetorical elements. All the weird sculptural things that do nothing. The thing, if he has a public space, he'll put some objects in it.
Yeah, there's the kind of concrete forest on top of the Unité d'Habitation. Aren't those rhetorical?
They're rhetorical, yeah.
They seem pretty
The
rhetorical.
giant chimney thing is rhetorical. Yeah. Like the forms at La Tourette, the whole of Chandigarh, like these objects in a landscape that don't, all of the sort of symbolic things that relate to other buildings but are really about creating a cosmic landscape and a...
Yeah. Or, Louis Kahn is full of rhetorical elements.
Classical architecture is obviously, a column as a monument is... That goes back a very long way and never really went away. There are, ancient, classical, medieval, Renaissance, Baroque examples, and modern examples. But he likes them. Or at least he likes these ones, which are very good ones. The thing is, what he seems to be liking is good architecture, which is good.
Yeah.
We like good architecture too, and we think liking good architecture is a good thing.
Yeah. There's a lot of good architecture in this book up until the point where he switches to talking about his own stuff, of which more later. In chapter 6, Accommodation and the Limitations of Order. This is an interesting one. It's very text heavy. It only has 2 pictures. One of them is a really interesting one. This facade by Sangallo, the Palazzo Tarugi, which is quite an interesting facade.
Now with this, I might be wrong, but I don't think that's the facade as he designed it.
Well, I think that's okay. I think that it's perfectly valid just to say that the way it's worked out actually is exemplary.
Also, if you're gonna say something's an architect who's a member of an architectural family, of whom there are 6 members who do things.
Yeah, don't say Sangallo.
You've got to give their first name.
It's like saying Gilbert Scott.
Yeah.
Yes, or Thomas Dean.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's a classical building. It's got 5 bays, a big one in the middle and little ones on either side. And what he likes about it, and it's got 3 floors. At the top floor, there's a sort of balustrade that's expressed across the front. And what he likes is that in the left-hand 2 bays, the order of things has been changed a bit to accommodate for something different on the ground floor, where the 2 arch-shaped openings have been fully opened up and have created this big ground level sort of arcade. And at the top level, it's as if the wall has been deleted and a loggia has been installed. But the columns and the overall classical rhythm and the line of the roof are all maintained. Yeah. So it's this kind of frame architecture which has been able to be amended.
It's a classical. So it's just what it's a classical version of just what Le Corbusier wanted to do with Maison Domino, where you have a grid which defines your architecture. Then within that, it can be an opening. It can pierce through the building and become a street. It can have one sort of window. It can be partially glazed. It can be fully glazed, and they have a patchwork.
Yeah.
So you have a grid, which is more than just a grid. It also has a sort of, each layer is different, but things can be different within it. Yeah. I feel like I was slightly doing what he's doing there, which is I'm deliberately trying to... Once you don't take things on his terms, once you state them as he would state them naturally, the polemic disappears, and you just say, it's nice when that happens.
It's a good building. It's a great reference.
Yeah, I've never been there.
No, Montepulciano, never been. So he has this quote: "A valid order accommodates the circumstantial contradictions of a complex reality." So, in a sense, this sort of sounds like it gestures towards what in the contemporary would think of as loose fit, the idea that an architecture should not address absolutely directly the program which is given to it on the day of the briefing, but rather allow for, as far as possible, the kind of reasonable development or reuse, even by possible for future tenants, owners.
Like Maison Domino.
Yeah.
The first modernist proposal.
And I think that that's fine. I mean, I think that, what is foreseeable and what isn't foreseeable. I think it is like a messy question, and it's not one that I guess he can really hope to
But I think what he likes
answer.
about it isn't that it's loose fit and adaptable. It's that the adaptation becomes attractive. Is that something that is uneven within a structure of something that is even. So you have a play. He is attracted to a play of harmony and dissonance.
Yeah, it's really worked out there.
Universal virtue in art.
Yes.
In its broadest sense of like human cultural output. And his other example is one of the viaduct that killed so many people they had to build a motorway church.
Oh, really? Is it?
Yeah.
Is the,
this is one of the ones that loads of
yes,
people
it
tried making.
is. On the Autostrada del Sole.
So this is one of these daring concrete things that they practiced very poor health and safety on.
It's beautiful, yeah. That's why they were so good at concrete, obviously. Yeah.
Well, I told you, they've been building... Like, look at all... There's tons of cool stuff built at this time, and at the end they got really good and they built that church.
Yeah.
It's going through a rugged, very hilly landscape, motorway, there's a viaduct, and the supports for the viaduct have to be all sorts of different heights, and the way they cope with the different heights is that basically it's like a fan with a kind of grid supporting it. Really cool thing. You'll have to just look it up if you want to see it.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll try and post this one.
And the spans are not all the same length, because if the column is short, it just moves up and the fan doesn't have to fan as far, and if the column has to be very tall, it can fan further.
Yes, so
grid
that's a
adapting
kind
to a
of,
landscape.
it's a kind of adaptation. I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because later on, he makes the case that, for instance, Grand Central Station has a certain adaptability. It's been able to survive a certain amount of entropy in its development because there are all of these different bits which have sort of filled it up.
Yeah.
All these kiosks and weird bits of crap. But for me, I sort of wonder, well, isn't that because in its original conception it was such a strong unity, and that you can throw a certain amount of crap into something which is like incredibly strongly expressed, and it will just shrug it off? It's not because they envisaged that people would put all of these 1960s like hot dog stalls or whatever inside it.
And if you think of Paddington or Paddington Station, or Paddington is probably the best example, where the building is kind of as it was, but it's full of a load of quite low-level junk, most of which was put in by Grimshaw, I think. All those pavilions, which are like the sandwich shop and the ticket shop and the various things, they really detract from the space. Like, they really don't help. Because they kind of block, because at the eye level, they block the long horizons.
Yeah.
And that's he perhaps would say it's because Paddington Station's not as good.
Yeah. I don't think it's true, though. I mean, I think that there are two things which often allow a building to survive these kinds of changes. One is often that there's something incredibly strong there originally, but which is not accommodating, but rather unaccommodating. The other is that often something which is highly generic so pure in a different way, which doesn't express any kind of ambiguity, but whose openness to programmatic changes of different kinds actually allows it to have a sort of flexibility long term.
What are you thinking about there?
If you think of sort of generic, like loft space or whatever, sure. I don't think that's, large span concrete framed like mid-century buildings are quite flexible.
But I don't think he cares about flexibility. I don't think that's what he's
that's not.
interested
But that's one of the problems with this, is that he's gesturing towards flexibility, but he's pretending that that's the same thing as this kind of semantic overdetermination and like contradiction and tension. But they're completely different things.
Well, the two examples he gives are completely different. Yeah. One is a classical building that has been adapted in a classical manner, and the other one is a one-off concrete construction which has got no potential for adaptation and no need. I mean, a bridge doesn't really need to be loose fit. There is no anticipated secondary application of it. Something which is a grid where the grid has adaptation, where the grid is adapted, is more interesting than a pure grid, where there's some dissonance in the grid, and that a really strong grid that's just a grid can adapt better than something that's not as strong.
At this point, I think we first encounter pop art and honky-tonk elements.
Oh yeah, we've had lots of poetry analogies before then.
Yeah.
He's fond of poetry analogies.
But he's keen that, I guess he's sort of interested in what the possibility of a pop architecture would be. So one which incorporates the visual noise and stimulus of the consumer age. And he talks about architecture as having a sort of a modest role.
Well, I mean, this page has got one of the strongest suggestions in the book for what people should do.
Another significant implication from pop art involves method in city planning. Architects and planners who peevishly denounce the conventional townscape for its vulgarity or banality promote elaborate methods for abolishing or disguising honky-tonk elements in the existing landscape, or for excluding them from the vocabulary of their new townscapes. But they largely fail either to enhance or to provide a substitute for the existing scene because they attempt the impossible. By attempting too much, they flaunt their impotence and risk their continuing influence as supposed experts. Cannot the architect and planner, by slight adjustments to the conventional elements of the townscape, existing or proposed, promote significant effects? By modifying or adding conventional elements to still other conventional elements, they can, by a twist of context, gain a maximum of effect through a minimum of means. They can make us see the same things in a different way. I mean, he means conventional in two different ways there, doesn't he? Conventional on the one hand is like the McDonald's sign or whatever, and on the other side is, volutes or something.
Yeah. There's another bit which is the bit that I initially had thought of, which is actually the 2 paragraphs before. Industry promotes expensive industrial and electronic research, but not architectural experiments. The federal government diverts subsidies towards air transportation, communication, the vast enterprise of war, or as they call it, national security, rather than towards the forces for the direct enhancement of life. The practicing architect must admit this. In simple terms, the budgets, techniques and programs for his buildings must relate more to 1866 than 1966. Architects should accept their modest role rather than disguise it and risk what might be called electronic expressionism, which might parallel the industrial expressionism of early modernist architecture. The architect who would accept his role as a combiner of significant old clichés and valid banalities in new contexts as his condition within society that directs its best efforts, its big money, and its elegant technologies elsewhere, can ironically express in this indirect way the true concern for society's inverted scale of values.
Okay, yeah, that's an important one, isn't it?
That's one hell of a set of statements there, actually.
Yeah.
Which is not present generally in the book. The book there's very few places where it's really propositional, but that's an interesting proposal.
There's an awful lot going on there.
Can that be serious? Can you be serious? So if I go back a bit, architects should accept their modest role rather than disguise it and risk what might be called electronic expressionism.
I don't know what that means.
Well, that's something bad. Which might parallel the industrial expressionism of modern architecture. That, I think, is... Maybe that's... If modernism's not just going to become picturesque, techno... Like, I think he would regard electronic expressionism as, like, high-tech.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. There's very little of it around at that point. Well, maybe, like, a little bit of Rudolph or Tangier or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's what he's thinking about.
Maybe. Anyway, if it's not going to be like that, the architect who would accept his role as a combiner of significant old clichés, valid banalities, in new context as his condition within society as his condition within a society that directs its best efforts, big money, and elegant technologies elsewhere, can ironically express in this indirect way a true concern for society's inverted scale of values. Now that is a truly dismal idea of what architecture is for. It seems to be that architecture should ironically suggest that society is all wrong and that everything is shit because we put all our efforts into war machines and consumerism. You can't be meaning that. What I'm saying there is a travesty of what I don't agree with him, but I don't think he's saying that, but you could read that out of it.
Well, valid banalities, I think that describes an awful lot of architecture. And is a resonant phrase. Significant old cliches.
Well, I think that's like the history, isn't it? I think significant old histories and valid banalities is like look for history to references and then recontextualize it. But then what the architect is doing is expressing in an indirect way the true concern of society's inverted scale of values.
But I think that just means doing your best for people and giving them what they need, rather than ushering everyone into a brave new world of technological enlightenment. It runs up against the limitations of what he's really interested about in architecture. You know, the significant old cliches are rarely typological forms in plan, like tried and tested apartment plans or whatever. They tend to be pretty banal, but actually also, well, we'll get onto it when we talk about the work, but, if you look ahead to the collective housing projects, for example, the cliches which they seem to be drawing on are not the right ones.
Are you sure, though, that it isn't the really bad interpretation a little bit? Because I think putting a giant television antenna on the top of an old people's home, suggesting that old people are just going to rot away their time watching television, kind of is suggesting true concerns for society's inverted scale of values.
Well, yeah, I think that is quite problematic, yeah.
And it seems to be that it's a manifesto for that a little bit.
There is a call here to find some accommodation between the townscape, what elsewhere he calls road town, the townscape of lots of signs and petrol stations and things, and the suburb, the kind of suburban artery, and Levitt town, which is literally suburbia.
Well, all the architecture he's got in here is real architecture-y it's really sculptural architecture. Yeah. Everything in here is very sculptural. And the solutions to mass housing are not. They should be nice to go around, but they're not essentially sculptural.
Yeah, there's very little of valid banalities in the images which are actually shown, and so it's a little bit difficult to know what's imagined. There are one or two vernacular buildings, but not very many of them.
But even those are sculptural vernacular buildings.
I think the other thing is that the architecture, the effects that he's talking about are almost always expressed in the plane of the facade. But the problem with that in the context of the situations that he's identifying is that facades aren't legible because you're in the land of the car. You can't really have a meaningful facade architecture once all of these urban spaces expand to fit the new scale of the freeway.
But he also says, the next thing he's saying, or quite soon afterwards, if I remember rightly, the facade, it's quite good if the facade is completely different from what's behind it. That means the facade is just a facade. It's if you'll say, once you've said that, the facade's capacity is just to be pleasurable and communicative.
Yeah, the city has to accommodate all of these popular elements, all of the sort of commercial growths and strange monstrosities. Well, that's all fine. It's not clear to me how an architecture can meaningfully address those things without being either kooky or patronising. Even the term honky-tonk, I think, the fact that these are these honky-tonk elements.
What does he mean exactly by honky-tonk?
I think he just means, pop vernacular. He means, the shop signs. He means the adverts. He means the cars, the neon, all that kind of, Yeah, well, maybe we can skip most of the next chapter because it's kind of boring and it has this long, rambling tour around the ideas of rectilinear and diagonal in modern architecture, which I think just makes no sense at all. I don't understand what he's trying to get at, and I think it's completely fatuous. But anyway, so then we get, as you say, this to continue the urban theme in the next chapter, Contradiction Adapted, we get this spread with Piazza San Marco.
And a rather good picture with people. It looks kind of like near-realist. All these people walking in different directions, very nicely framed.
Times Square.
And what we've got in Times Square are lots of 60s advertisements for films and musicals.
Highway USA.
Which is like mainly a big picture of an Esso sign, but like it's the freeway, isn't it?
And developers' houses, which I think is...
rows of clapboard, timber, identical, pitch roof, chimney, TV aerial houses.
Made of ticky-tacky, very much the vibe. And this, I wrote, when I was reading this, I read that this contradiction is sort of Venturi's own architectural revolution moment, in the sense that he says that we don't have to have... alluding there to Corbusier at the end of Towards the New Architecture. We don't have to have Road Town or Levitt Town, but we sort of need to find a way of living in the middle of both of them, or making something which draws on both of them and is better. But as I said, I think that requires engaging with a kind of urban problem, which is the problem of how you do scale when everything is about driving.
I'm going through the bit again to try and work out what he's on about. I mean, the first thing the connection between San Marco and Times Square is that he thinks that they're similar. Yeah. He thinks that in these huge billboards and in the bustling street below is rather like the huge buildings of San Marco and the bustle of the square. Somehow the billboards and the noise is similar to the architecture, the architectural, the rich facades and the tower, is like the rich facade that is an enormous advertisement for a thriller.
Yes, they are not without contradictions in the Piazza San Marco. The buildings are different and contrasting. And in Times Square, obviously, it's a visual cacophony of all sorts of posters and the like. The problem is that between those two, the idea of complexity and contradiction is reduced to a level of like total banality as an observation.
It seems our fate now to be faced with either the endless inconsistencies of Road Town, which is Big Road, or with the infinite consistencies of Levitt Town, like an estate, as we would call it now, which is boredom. In Road Town, we have a false complexity. In Levitt Town, we have a false simplicity. One thing is clear. From such false consistency, real cities can never grow, will never grow. Cities, like architecture, are complex and contradictory.
That's going to change. At this point, he's not quite got round to the point of sort of valorising highway signage, but he'll get there eventually. I guess from the recognition.
But he's also in the middle of that. There's a parenthesis which I skipped out, which is if in God's Own Junkyard, Peter Blake. So this is I haven't read the book, but he's brought it up several times. Had chosen examples of roadside landscape for his book, which are less extremely, in inverted commas, bad. His point, at least involving the banality of roadside architecture, would ironically have been stronger. So I would take from that Venturi thinks that the most bad examples are the ones that he finds most interesting. And it is the banality of... It's not the... He is attracted to the vulgarity, as you could call it, of like the extremely messy, extremely brash moments.
The hot dog stand shaped like a big hot dog or whatever.
Yeah.
So he's been trying to talk about how contradiction can be more adaptive or more clashing, whether it can be played down or played up. I think that between these paragraphs, it's not really like, I don't think that it...
Blah, blah, blah. He says some things which don't make much sense as well.
Yeah, he has a great reference here, this amazing, sadly now demolished Frank Furnace building in Philadelphia, which is a hell of a good one, on page 56.
Yeah.
That's a good one. which is it's a bit like the one we brought up in the Caruso talk. The
Would you like some?
yeah, what's his name? Watson Fothergill.
Watson Fothergill.
Watson Fothergill. I mean, I think Furness's one is even better.
Furness
to be
one's
honest,
better than
because
Watson
because the way it uses scale is so amazing.
Furness's is kind of more nouveau. It's almost like a kind of Belgian. I think the way they talk about him, he must be famous in America. He sure ain't famous here.
He's a big Philadelphia architect, yeah, but they knocked down most of the best ones. I mean,
It's got All St. Margaret Street.
yeah. Which I don't regard as particularly clashing. I think often his readings are a bit strange. It makes me wonder if we've been to them.
Well, I think all he's saying with that one is that the massing of it's complicated. I don't think there's anything very exciting that he says in this bit. There's a bit when he says Vanbragh's Eastbury reminds him of Jasper John's Three Flags, which I thought was quite a funny one.
Well, because he's interested in superimposition, so things on top of other things.
Yeah.
And this really is the...
Colin Rose bit on does this so much better. Just absolutely knocks this into a cocked hat, because he's sort of saying something similar, but just in a much more sophisticated way.
Rose is a much better critic. But there are some great... there's this Gloucester Cathedral one, which is... which combines a sort of diagonal buttress, and
this one's interesting because that buttress actually he doesn't show it here, but that buttress goes from outside the building supporting the tower through the roof, through the tracery to the ground.
Yeah, and it's amazing the way it's been accommodated by this kind of surface Gothic detail is really really beautiful.
It's really cool. It wasn't initially the idea, and it's a Jerry-built sort of insertion, which kind of mucks up what the intention of the building is.
They had to do this with all the English cathedrals because they put big towers on all of them, and then they all fell.
And then they all started falling over, and they're like, oh.
Yeah,
better
basically in all of them.
And they either got in all of them, but famously in Gloucester and Wells.
They either got fixed or they fell over.
Yeah.
Salisbury had to get fixed.
But Salisbury, they managed to integrate it and make it work.
Yeah, some of them they managed to fix, and then
without. But I mean, the interventions in Gloucester and Wells are really.
And some of them fell down, like Lincoln and Hereford, just fell right
Lincoln
over.
was the tallest building in the world for a bit.
So yes, I mean it was a serious problem.
Yeah. Edie's got a lantern because it fell down.
Yeah,
but they built a really cool thing instead. But anyway.
It's super. He's got all these terms.
Superimposition. It's just
superimposition, super adjacency, but you can. What's important here is that you can start to see him moving towards his own design method that he's interested in, which is about collage fundamentally, like this kind of collage of elements. This pretends to be about a contrast between the inside and outside of buildings, but it's really. So what he wants to condemn are buildings which look the same on the inside and outside. I don't really understand how.
Or does he actually condemn it? Or does he just say that modernists don't do this?
Yeah, but I just think it's not true. Like, I can't think of any buildings which are the same on the inside and the outside.
But also, like, the Johnson Wax building is famously, from the outside, it's just a wall.
It's completely different on the inside. It's this bizarre organic forest.
Yeah, hidden by, it's very like. Two of his buildings that are different are the old Bank of England building, and in fact it's just as true of the new one, only the new one is less good, and Santa Maria Maggiore, which are both, they feel like city blocks. The old Bank of England is just this huge wall on the outside.
Yeah.
Santa Maria Maggiore feels like it's full of, on the outside it feels like it's loads of buildings. It feels like it's loads of like blocks of flats with a church in the middle of it, but actually it's all church.
Yeah, I was writing my notes here. I was like, he sort of says that he's going to discuss space here, but then but basically just goes straight back to it being about facades, and most of the chapter is about facades. He also has some completely like bizarre things that he says. There's one bit where he talks about this house in Switzerland, which he says is contradictory because it has a single roof with multiple rooms inside it. On page 72, which I think is just that's so tendentious.
That's another statement, which is this isn't inane as this wall is a brilliant wall because it both separates spaces and supports something. This roof is an amazing roof because under one roof there are several rooms.
I don't get it. In modern architecture, he says, Philip Johnson, has been almost unique in emphasising multiple enclosure in plan and section, which I think is pretty bizarre for someone who worked for Louis Kahn, because that's absolutely his thing as well. There's a great set of references which are really about interstitial space. So spaces within spaces and kind of gaps between spaces, including one which I think is amazing is this section through a Polish synagogue, lost wooden... I can't remember which page it's on. 81.
81. Oh, cool.
It's very cool, isn't it? Which has this kind of outer form and then these curving inner forms, which are a little bit reminiscent of Jørn Utzon's Bagsværd church, this Danish modern church. It's sort of wiggly, two-dimensional forms, which are kind of paper thin. And I think he's really onto something there. I mean, interstitial spaces are rather fascinating to explore.
He's had quite a bit of talking about them in Soane's house as well. There's a discussion of how he uses these little spaces between spaces, which is a classic Beaux-Arts thing to do, really, isn't it? I mean, these are particularly good examples.
Well, he has this term he calls the open poché. So the idea that rather than having the gaps between your main spaces as sort of blocked in or very much service space, that they become an inhabitable behind-the-scenes void of some kind. Yeah. He's got the plan also of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, which is quite an extraordinary...
Yeah, he should have got Plečnik in here. Plečnik is a real dab hand at the open poché. That's a good one in the library and in his Flatiron building and various others.
Yeah, God, it does go on a bit actually for quite
blah
short.
Blah blah blah, loads of pages. I mean, he does keep saying more things. They sort of mean things, but they're not.
There's a great reference here to which is this building, the Hôtel de Matignon in Paris, which is this very ingenious, symmetrical Beaux-Arts construction, but which actually, where there's a front entrance and the back entrance which are offset, but both of them appear sort of harmoniously symmetrical.
There's lots of the hotels. This isn't even a particularly... Lots of the hotels in Paris do this sort of thing. There's a real genre. You get even ones where the back and the front are different. One wall is pretending to be a building, but the building is only like 2 foot deep, and it's got windows just enough that you can sort of squeeze in to create the sense of a great court, which is kind of what's going on here, but at an even more extreme degree. Because there's a period at the beginning of the French Baroque when they're really, in these urban sites, really want to create order. Or you could have also put in Beauvais, this very famous Baroque hotel, which achieves the same thing by having all these seemingly symmetrical sort of oval shapes, which are actually asymmetrical, and then everything is curved. It's a really strange plan. It's now a court, I think.
I mean, I have lots of notes for this chapter because it just has lots of really good buildings in it, but I also wrote at one point, pretty half-baked. Yeah. Some are about thresholds. I think he's making a case for threshold spaces. Fair enough, yeah. Thresholds are important. Okay, well, I think we should summon our energy and try and get our heads around the obligation toward a difficult whole.
Because this is a more important one, I think.
Because this is the last chapter and it's the conclusion.
Well, it seemed to me that he likes it when a load of different things are assembled into a big thing. Yeah. And he says there's different ways you can do this.
He has a comparison here, which I actually use. So this really brings out his skill at using images. He has this comparison between Vanbragh's Blenheim and Holcombe Hall, which I think is by William Kent. Which are these two, one is a Baroque, sort of late Baroque house, and one is a neoclassical house. And he has the little comparison of the two elevations. It's a very good... I use this in my lecture to explain the difference between the late Baroque and the neoclassical to my students, and it makes it extremely clear. He's got a real eye for the kind of explanatory potential of an image. And the difference between them is whether the parts could be independent from one another, or whether the parts are all kind of related in a complicated way where they are interdependent, and to separate one out would create a bit of a formal monstrosity, right?
Yeah. Which is semi-true.
I mean, if you chopped one of the ends off Blenheim Palace, it would look like an eccentric person might design in the late 19th century.
Or Brazzini would design in the late 1940s, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, it's like a late Baroque, it would go super weird.
Yeah. Be kind of cool.
Yeah, Baroque revival, rather. The weird
neo-Baroque.
fringe of the Baroque revival is where it would belong. Yeah, I think that this is okay, this chapter. One of the weird ones is that, so he has this otherwise rather obscure building, the orphanage of Il Buon Pastore near
Which we
Rome.
were talking about last week. The Good Shepherd's or the Good Shepherd's Orphanage?
Yeah, it will be the episode before last. The one about, or rather the bonus for the episode before last. It's the Italian fascism bonus.
Well, I discovered it for Italian fascism, and then I discover it now. But when he was visiting it, it must have been less than 20 years old.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary neo-Baroque building. Still with its spikes.
Yes, at this point it still had the spikes. They must have been politically incorrect somehow, because they took them off.
No, I think they were worried about them falling off and crushing the kiddywinks.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think they were deemed structurally unsound. I don't think it's a political problem. I think we should kickstart getting them back on again. It definitely looks better.
He says, this neo-Baroque complex, bizarre in 1940 and admittedly questionable for an asylum for little girls, astonishingly composes a multitude of diverse parts into a difficult whole. Well, he's right. It's a hell of a thing. It looks extraordinary.
Yeah. We should go there when we... I certainly will when I go back. It's not very far out. It's quite a building.
There's some great references. I like the... yeah. I think I'm not always totally clear about what the spin is that he's trying to put on them.
No, I mean, the Buon Pastore, the Good Shepherd Orphanage, he's saying it seems super asymmetrical. Actually, it's completely symmetrical. It's self-similar, and but at such a big distance that it is like surfing right on the edge of that being at all apparent, and sometimes it's apparent and sometimes it's not apparent, and he likes that. It's
weird because this building is about as willfully picturesque as they come. It's
grotesquely picturesque.
It's in it's like Mad King Ludwig's castle in Bavaria or something. It's that kind of building. It's so exaggerated. It's so bizarre the way it's massing its position in the landscape,
and also like quite clunking. It's not graceful.
Yeah, as if we hadn't said it enough already, it sort of shows how partial the judgments in the book are. It's just a question of what he feels like and what he doesn't.
I mean, he doesn't have bad taste.
No.
He likes the right things. It's just that he tries to create an argument for them that's not completely sustainable.
Okay, so we get back onto his grudge against Peter Blake's God's Own Junkyard, which is what he's kind of phrasing as the problem, because the problem of the difficult whole is for him the problem which modern architecture has to address, right? I think that's the programme here. Peter Blake has compared the chaos of commercial Main Street with the orderliness of the University of Virginia. Besides the irrelevancy of the comparison, it's a bit rich coming from him, is not Main Street almost all right? Indeed, is not the commercial strip of a Route 66 almost all right? As I have said, our question is, what slight twist of context will make them all right? So, that's the mission for architecture, the modest mission for architecture, is this slight twist of context, whatever that happens to be. So, right at the end, he says, some of the vivid lessons of pop art involving contradictions of scale and context should have awakened architects from prim dreams of pure order, which unfortunately are imposed in the easy gestalt unities of the urban renewal projects of establishment modern architecture, and yet, fortunately, are really impossible to achieve at any great scope. And it is perhaps from the everyday landscape, vulgar and disdained, that we can draw the complex and contradictory order that is valid and vital for our architecture as an urbanistic whole. So, it's still ultimately about order. What architecture has to do is to, in this modest, ingenious way, deploying whatever they were, banalities and cliches, to bring order to the kind of pop road junkyard landscape. But order in what way? What does order mean? I mean, he shows approvingly typical Main Street USA. I don't know where this actually is. It's this kind of big, wide street. I think it's worth saying that as a subject of what we're going to have to live with, this street is a little bit strange because it is an image of an American city on the edge of extinction. Because in almost every city, what's going to happen is they're going to knock down like half these buildings to build new, bigger commercial developments. And they're going to knock down the other half of them to build surface car parks. And they're going to get rid of the streetcars. And all of the buildings are going to go bust. And really, the future is not this, but it's what he calls road town. It's the road of like the malls and the cars and everything else like that. Sort of rigorous functional separation.
Yes, which actually he's against, quite rightly.
I think that I'm not sure he's totally clear about what the real adversary is here.
Well, no, I think he's pretty clear what the adversary is. It's God's own junkyard.
God's own junkyard, yeah.
If you were going through the book with us, I think you'd have, like the contemporary Nixon-Kennedy debate, which was a bit before then, the TV audience perhaps would get a different opinion, although I think that thing may not be entirely true, because he buys himself an awful lot of slack by the quality of the references and pictures he's got. Yeah. If you're basing it solely off the text, I'm not sure you come away with a lot. Propositionally, it's very thin and uncertain, and at the bigger critical level, it doesn't make any sense. It's willfully tendentious, but it's not even willfully tendentious towards an aim. It's willfully tendentious and aimless.
I think that the places where I agree with him most, it seems like either there is an enormous implication that he's not really taking into account. If this is all about facades, then you have to have a kind of urban program which allows you to create them.
And the next book is more propositional.
Yeah, it's a lot more propositional and it has much more. But in a way, I think a lot of it is latent in this book. The book is actually addresses itself almost entirely to style, almost entirely to elevations, actually. Like, I would say it's about 70%.
Elevational details.
Yeah, a little bit of plans, but in that very Beaux-Arts way where the plan is understood as an extremely abstracting kind of device.
Very few of the observations about plans are good. Whereas lots of the observations about elevations are. Plan you experience at one remove, elevation you experience quite directly when you're experiencing a building. So an ambiguity in plan is really an ambiguity in space, if you experience it in that way. And I'm not sure he's as successfully bridges that gap, but it may be just that it is more difficult to interpret.
Yeah, the readings of plan are often also very much about type form or
they're very Beaux-Arts.
Yeah, they're very like academic, actually. When he talks about the deficiencies of modern architecture, he often either talks about or gestures towards this kind of absolutely classic, nailed on, like almost platitudes about what's wrong with it. It's rigidity, it's zoning, it's kind of the violence of its urban program, the inflexibility of its spaces. But he actually doesn't frame any response to it on those particular grounds. He just comes across into this other world that he's happy in, which is the graphic world of rectangle arranging and the dance of elements across the plane of the facade.
He's tried to do something much less ambitious than Rowe or Rossi, which are other ones, or Pevsner was someone I was thinking about with this. I mean, who's really trying to work out what's going on, and really are prepared to make more definitive statements. I'm prepared to try and propose what's causing things to happen. He at no point suggests any reason why anything would be like this or like that. He just says this is good.
The call to recognise architecture's limits and to try and identify what it can actually do, which is socially useful, I think is not wrong.
Yeah, that's the limited agency of the architect.
Yeah, that's one we sort of seem to come back to. At the same time, no, I mean, he seems to have an idea that they are going to make compromises with road town the landscape of signs, make certain compromises, and bring some kind of order. We should stop talking about it.
Okay, let's stop talking about this. This can also be almost be a part one, and we'll have more conclusions later.
Yeah, so I guess on the bonus we're going to talk about his buildings because we didn't get to that.
I've only been to one of them, so my observations will be no doubt off, except about that one, which I have quite strong opinions about.
Oh, good. Well, you have all of that to look forward to. I hope this was all right. We will be doing the other half of the project very soon, I imagine. And I'll post some images from the book at our various social media sites.
About buildings?
Yeah, about underscore buildings.
About underscore buildings?
Yeah. If you want to listen to our bonus episodes, which you're very welcome to do, you have to pay £3 a month to our Patreon, which is
$3. Much cheaper.
$3, yeah. Not that much cheaper now. Which is patreon.com/about_buildings. You can email us at aboutbuildingsandcities@gmail.com.
If another $33 a month worth of you do it, we have to put one out every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So there's something to think of. Very slight, you know.
Oh, well, that'll be something. Yeah.
God, we should be more enthusiastic. You sound like you're going to die.
I'm pretty tired. I've had a hard old week, but we're doing our best to think about architecture.
We think about architecture all the time. It's always in our hearts.
Yeah, it's
always return to it.
Yes. Valid Banalities, I think, are going to draw to a close now. This has been About Buildings and Cities. I'll remember our editor is Matthew Lloyd Roberts. That's the thing to say.
Brilliant. He's like, we're really... It'll be quite a while before I think you experience this in full, but we're getting a lot more stuff ready to come out.
Yes. Very helpful.
See if we can make it work. Might be another round of teething problems, but I think teething problems is rather the nature of About Buildings and Cities. So, with that...
Yeah, honky-tonk elements and all.
Yeah. Good night.
Night.